This trialogue continues a series of discussions exploring the latest interdisciplinary research into tantric completion stage practices such as yogas of dream, sleep, and death. Dr. Tawni Tidwell is a biocultural anthropologist and Doctor of Traditional Tibetan Medicine. Dr. Michael Sheehy is the Director of Research at the Contemplative Sciences Center in the Department of Religious Studies in the University of Virginia. Dr. Julian Schott is an Indologist, Tibetologist, and Assistant Professor at the University of Vienna. In this episode, the panel explore the ethical and methodological challenges of studying Buddhist Tantra. Consider the various agendas behind scientific research into meditation, gTummo, dream yoga, and more, and argue for the centering of human liberation alongside human wellness and profit motives. Dr. Sheehy presents his working model for achieving contemplative fluency across a range of meditation styles, suggests that scientific study of meditation can be seen as a type of cultural translation, and considers the use of etic frameworks to study religious and cultural forms. Dr. Tidwell argues for the validity of subjective experience. Dr. Schott points out the tensions within religious traditions, and the panel consider if neuroscience might one day teach Buddhism something about itself.
Tawni Tidwell, Michael Sheehy, and Julian Schott, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Steve. Great to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted to see you all again. Something of a reunion. We had two fascinating episodes. In the first episode, Michael took us through dream yoga, lucid dreaming, and that fascinating subject. And then we discussed many things off the back of that. And the second episode began with a deep dive into Tukdam. And Tawni revealed to us the various researches that are happening in that field. And those were fascinating episodes indeed. However, quite specific. And as we were discussing before, we thought, well, what if we were to take a step back from these very close looks at particular tantric techniques, particular tantric phenomena, we could say, and look at the whole frame of this idea of studying Tantra at all through these scientific, neuroscientific, etc. lenses. Why are we doing that? I think sometimes these contemplative neuroscience explorations, a criticism of them, is people say, well, we're looking to validate or justify these practices by finding some kind of biological correlate, some neurocorrelate, maybe some sort of hormone or something that we can point to and say, look, it's real. We can see it on a graph. Is that why we study tantric practice, to prove that it's really happening? Or perhaps, as in much mindfulness research, there's a concern, as Tawni, you mentioned this before we began, there's a concern for health, well-being. Maybe we can take these practices out of their religious context and apply them in a general context of well-being, maybe even monetize them in some way as a sort of therapy, something like that. These are, I think, some of the ideas that people have when they think about contemplative neuroscience. Is that what we're doing here when we're studying Tantra? So this also, I think, implies ethical or philosophical, maybe teleological, maybe concerns about this. So what if we do that? What if we take a step back and we consider this whole scientific study of Tantra? Why are we doing it? And what are the considerations from that point of view?
I think what's interesting, Steve, is that we assume that Tantra, right, is a coherent object that we can study. And it's such a vastly complex entity that has many different parts, has many different lineages and schools. I mean, if we even just look at the breakdown from, say, Tibetan Buddhist perspective on preliminaries themselves have so many complicated aspects of refuge and bodhicitta, purification, right, mandala offering, also the deity yoga. And so it's like each of those could be so vastly unpacked before we even get to generation and completion stages. So I think from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, understanding what these things are doing in changing paradigms and perceptions of the world, of oneself, of how one engages the world, of values and that conduct that we express in terms of our behavior and our relationships. So I think when we say, what are we doing in the study of Tantra, I think we really need to start honing in on that it can be aspects that are looked at in terms of also skills that are developed, right? And transformations that are cultivated. And there's an entire repertoire that is used and techniques that are brought into focus that provides a very, very complex, multivariate technology, right? That is doing many things at once. Um, yeah, I'd love to hear, Michael. I think that a lot of what you guys have done at UVA is trying to map that and create a vocabulary around many different practices, the components, the grammar, the syntax. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys think about those components?
Yeah, so thanks, Tony. I completely agree. The landscape of Tantra is vast and complex. Tantra is a culture, right? Tantra is a culture, and it's not an object. I think that, our interest is in the contemplative practices that are, more broadly contemplative practices. But then looking at, examples certainly from the Tibetan Buddhist traditions and Vajrayāna, we've really come to work through a model which I'll very briefly describe it to talk about contemplative practices. And we think about practices fundamentally to make a distinction between instances and styles. So instances is a very specific practice that you would perform, and even that can have great variability. So whether you call that zazen or vipassana or tai chi, etc., those are all names of practices that people can perform. And within zazen, there's variability. Within tai chi, there's different variabilities. Within, vipassana, etc. In fact, vipassana means many different things. Whether it be from different traditions, the techniques can be varied. But all of those then are distinct from styles. And what we mean by styles is more categorically as a kind of heuristic how we think about practices. So there's attentional styles, that is to say, practices that are designed to intentionally cultivate sustained and balanced attention. There's imaginal styles, that is to say, practices and techniques that are designed to cultivate the imaginal capacity of the mind. There's somatic styles that are really body oriented and body centric, which might include movement and breath work. So there can be sub styles as well, and non-dual styles, and so on and so forth. We've come up with a kind of taxonomy of styles that are these kind of broader rubrics of contemplative practice. And then once we have that, the distinction between instances, that is to say, historical instances that may be linked to a tradition or a kind of instruction, etc., and then styles, which are again are broader and more categorical. And then we're interested in how a particular practice can have multiple styles. That is to say, how complex practices are multi-modular. And if we're looking at Tantra, some of the things that Tawni had referenced in just a cursory glance at what tantric practices subsume, everything from the preliminaries, which again, there's different sets of the preliminaries. There's classic set of 6, but then there's classic sets of 9. Those sets of 6 are not all the same, whether they're Nyingma or Sarma, and then within Nyingma, there's different variants within Sarma, or the later traditions and schools of Buddhism, there's different variants, et cetera, and then so on and so forth. We can talk about different ways that the Buddhist traditions talk about practices, but if we're to look at some of those seemingly simple practices, take Guru Yoga, for instance, or the mandala offering, these are classic preliminary practices, Vajrasattva, take any one of those, there are multi-modular practices. That is to say, they involve multiple styles of a practice. They'll involve typically some kind of attention orientation during a period or part of the practice. Then they'll have an imaginal dimension, or stylistically, where you're invoking mental imagery. They'll have somatic moments of the practice where you're engaged, often auditory, so there's sonic dimensions, et cetera, and all these are what we call the different expressions of contemplative styles. And the more then complex the practice comes, the more multi-modular it is, and practices can have 2, 4, many modulars. Complex practices have multiple modules of styles that they're invoking. And then you learn how to become what we call fluent. That is to say, you learn how to work within this fluent pattern of going from one style and shifting to the other style, going back to the style, and sometimes working with the tension between styles. Often classic practices are designed to juxtapose styles in ways that make them complex. And as you become more and more adept and skilled at contemplative practices and undertake more contemplative complex practices, then the contemplative styles are more and more arranged in ways that kind of challenge each other from one modality to another, which is oftentimes, theoretically at least, there to really help the practitioner cultivate their fluency, their ability to flow within the different styles and expand their sensibilities of styles. And all of that is to say, anyways, I could go on and on about the model, but just to sort of say that, the idea here with contemplative fluency, and particularly fluency of multiple styles, is that you're then cultivating the complexity of the human being. And from the very beginning, these practices, Buddhist Tantra for sure, begins from a stance, an outlook that human beings are extraordinarily complex, multifaceted, living beings, and that in order to transform them, there's a complexity required in order to do that. And to go on and on, I can talk about some of the ways that I've come to think about how some of those styles look more generally, but I'll pause there so that others can have voice. But that's the basic model we're looking at. And then, within a framework of sort of classical or so-called emic categories as well, of models of meditation where, you're just looking at body, speech, and mind, body, voice, and mind, and how then styles overlap with the body, with auditory or sonic expressions, and then with the activities of the mind, because Buddhists are very much oriented towards an activity or an event ontology of the mind. So it's how do we actualize those via contemplative technique, and the styles again are there designed to do that. Enough said.
And I just want to point out that Michael really beautifully laid the landscape to say that actually each of these components could be studied for their own reason, right? You can be looking at just attentional capacities and in different skills or techniques or instances, styles, and expressions of doing that, and how does that look differently? So say a cognitive neuroscientist wants to just study attention, they can use the study of Tantra virtuosos, right, expertise who have developed these skills, and see how they have developed that capacity over a longitudinal or at a kind of final expression of expertise, but they could also be looking at the visualization capacities, looking at some of the somatic elements. And I think that one example of that is thinking about, say, tummo, and understanding how people can override autonomic nervous system responses, right? And so people might not be interested in tummo at all, but you might have individual scientists that are interested in looking at, wow, is this capacity possible? And are there individuals in this world who have trained to be able to do that? In a similar sense, in tukdom, we're looking at, is there ways that we could look at consciousness in a way that is not necessarily purely an epiphenomenon of the brain, right? Is there other expressions of vitality that come into the body? I think Melanie Boley, Peter Malinowski, and Julia Tononi's work are looking at pure presence, not really interested in meditation, really interested in actually testing this integrated information theory of consciousness in a way that provides a context for them to look at activity in the brain in a specific setting with people who can do that. Whereas in other settings, people can't necessarily generate that brain state. So I think there's different ways of accessing it. And I think on one side also with tukdom, we could say that we aren't testing pieces of Tantra, we're looking at the culmination of a lifetime, right? And what does that look like in its expression in death? So just to think about when we lay this landscape, there's different questions people will ask to look at what's happening in these remarkably complex technologies of cultivating the complexity of being human, as Michael beautifully said. So,
if I may, there's two things, I suppose, that looking historically at the development of Vajrayāna that make some sense to maybe think about as you want to lay the landscape, as you say. That is actually very important, but not so much addressed. And I think it summarizes a lot of what you have been saying by just looking at one of the basic claims of that tradition. And one of the basic claims is, of course, not that the result that is being achieved is fundamentally different from what other methods that have been used before were promising, but the speed with which this result supposedly manifest. Yeah. So if we think about like what do I need in order to do something quicker than others, there seem to be like two things that the tradition very much emphasizes. They do not call it like that, but we could say they paraphrases or they implicitly mention it. So there is the idea of upaya or tap or method that is incredibly important in the Vajrayāna tradition, and that is much stronger emphasized. And particularly they speak to the fact that there is a variety of methods, which presupposes a high degree of flexibility and dynamics. And that is actually something that both of you have repeatedly mentioned as one of the, let's say, characterizing features of Tantra, that it is very complex. But you could even go so far as to say that complexity itself is more or less synonymous with the idea of Tantra. In a certain way, you could have this hypothesis, and then you could ask, well, in which way is it true that a high degree of complexity and flexibility is supposedly leading quicker to certain results that we want to achieve, and in which way can or can we not observe this degree of condensedness, flexibility, and complexity in comparison to other traditions? And I think that in some sense, if we want to zoom out and look at the tradition as such, I do believe that by looking at these categories, there would indeed be a relatively simple category that we could use in the, let's say, in the pursuit of trying to characterize Tantra as opposed to what is not Tantric, Vajrayāna, secret mantra tradition in one way or the other. And I think it really comes from this central claim that they were postulating themselves within the tradition. And I just want to bring that in because when we look or want to look at the mechanics of it and lying the landscape, I think it does make sense to try to keep that in mind and to think about what is the implications of such a claim, because historically speaking, this is the one fundamental claim that they made, yeah, and that was really new.
The traditions also make the claim, if you like, that that expedience to which you reference, upaya, is most adept when humans are at their limits. And that there are certain thresholds of being alive that can be harnessed to catalyze transformation. So hence we look at Tantra introduces techniques at threshold states, right? So sleeping, dreaming, sex, death and dying. These are all classic modalities of tantric practice, right? And in each of them, you're undergoing a physical or psychological extreme that heightens your acuity, whether it be tonic alertness or physiological responses, so that if done intentionally with technique, you can flip ordinary consciousness, even for a moment. And that ability just to turn on a dime the ordinary habitual modes of perception and cognition is so powerful, these traditions suggest, that if you do that in a systematic manner, having prepared yourself under guidance in safe conditions as a regimen for training, it will be more expedient than other modalities of human transformation. So if we're going to talk about upaya, which I think is great, and I wouldn't say it's totally speed. I think it has more to do with expedience at the thresholds of being human. And maybe that introduces a kind of acceleration of transformation, accelerated transformation. And, you know, so Tantra takes so there's three classic approaches to contemplative technique in the Buddhist tradition, what we call antidotal, transformative, and self-liberative. And, you know, the antidotal approach is literally applying remedies or antidotes to afflictions and cognitive and perceptual patterns, emotional patterns, even, you know, physical somatic patterns that prevent, inhibit, in some way trip up spiritual and human transformation. The transformative approach takes those patterns and changes them into something else, right? From the unwholesome to the wholesome is the classic Buddhist languaging, the akusala to the kusala, and that there's a whole kind of alchemical analogy used here. And it's basically, you know, you're taking one set of habit patterns and you're transforming them into another. So the negative into the positive, you could say, unwholesome into the wholesome, the spiritually demeaning into the spiritually efficacious. The third approach is self-liberative, right? That is to say, ability to recognize these gaps in habitual patterns themselves. And again, cognitive, perceptual, somatic, emotional. And in those gaps is extraordinary freedom. And when you become familiarized over and over with returning to those liminal spaces, then that will open up and dismantle all of the patterning that has held the samsaric being in its place. And this is what Tantra seeks to do, right? It seeks to not just transform, although it does transform through some technique, but mostly it says if we take this experience of threshold and liminal experiences of human consciousness and human physicality, embodiment and enworldment, and we push them to their moments of, extreme, then those will open up the gaps, and those will eventually dissolve these constrictive habitual constraints of the samsaric being. So anyways, that's one kind of classic way to talk about it as well, Julian, right?
Yeah, very well. I mean, I think the last approach, which we call self-liberative, some people maybe would call revelatory or something like this. It's almost like you work too much a moment of an epiphany. I do not know, for a lack of a better word, but the interesting thing is, of course, all of these practices, they are meant to transform you in one or the other way. The question is like, what kind of transformation is happening? And the particular thing within Tantra seems to me that there is a certain radical nature to it, and it is, of course, you can also see it, how it was conceived, like beyond looking at the, let's say, psychology or the mechanics of the practice themselves. You can see this, of course, also in the way of how authors positioned themselves within the society and the times within which they were living. So there is a lot of progressive nature there, and also transgressive nature there. And all of this, I believe, is different aspects that speak to a certain elements that seem to be more radical than others. And I mean, you have described that very well, I suppose. But yeah, what interests then me is, personally, if I think about coming back to science and painting a bigger picture, so in which way can we address such a characterization that seems to be of a rather general nature? Yeah, and that in some sense, as soon as the practice should be labeled a tantric practice, a Vajrayāna practice, whatever the specifics of that practice may be, in one way or the other, they should. So it seems to me, like in this discussion that we're having, they should in one way or the other fit these categories, however we call them. Like you talk about thresholds, I talk about a certain sense of speed, or however we like to call it. We can certainly find good definitions for this, but yeah, how to address that aspect that seems indeed, and I think I repeat myself and stop there, a somewhat a general category that is important to think about.
Well, I will say, I think that we also are witnessing partly a tension within the traditions, right? That these are mechanisms, not necessarily ultimate expressions. And that some schools might see them as nested, the anecdotal nested within the transformative, nested within the self-liberative, and that there might be an entire path, that foundations are laid perhaps in the anecdotal side that then get cultivated over time through the transformative means and eventually lead to self-liberative practices. Others might say you can go straight to self-liberative, or maybe others say that you should really focus on just one or the other, right? And I think that's part of what we're looking at Tukdom, is that it is this ultimate expression that I think all three could probably contribute to. We do tend to say that self-liberative is probably one of the most likely expressions of that in that moment, but without the other two, it's theorized that you can't actually reach the Tukdom state. So I think that's a really interesting exploration to think about these as mechanisms for a certain kind of expression.
Yeah, and they're back to what I was saying earlier, just at least linking the idea of contemplative styles as different, again, from instances, is that these mechanisms, as you say, are, there are ways that the styles then express themselves, right? So there are kind of approaches to applying the styles, and just like the styles can be multi faceted and multimodal and complex practices, so can these mechanisms. That is to say, typically along a trajectory of an individual's spiritual path, if I may, there will be moments where, you know, they may be undergoing transformative technique or experience and get caught up, in which case they'll need to apply an antidote, apply an antidotal practice in order to sort of overcome that inhibition or that obscuration or obstruction, in order for the transformation to fully complete itself. Or there may be moments or glimpses of a kind of self-liberative nature, and yet the sort of overcoming of that, or the sort of post moment, if you will, may then very well lead to something that's much more transformative as a kind of life event. So these are not linear in any true sense of experience, but more of kind of ways of identifying how human experience through contemplative practice techniques, is understood by the traditions. Yeah.
But you see, that's interesting that you say this. Of course, you find all of the different, let's say, styles and schemes within one complex traditions, exactly as you described. Yeah. And interestingly enough, you can see that also a sadhana is not very linear, you know. I mean, when you think about the fact that you, I don't know, let's say that you start with, how to call it best, like mainstream Mahayana philosophical doctrine, let's just call it like that. Yeah. Okay, so you start out with the general stuff, and then suddenly everything disappears. Then something reappears, then you imagine something, and again, you know, like this process you go through a couple of times, you know, like you live an entire life from birth to death and conception, you know, like more than once in a single sitting. Yeah. Until you go into the, let's say, completion stage, where you bring in, as you also said, like somatic and sonic aspects, and aspects that have a very strong, let's say, bodily connotation, and that go along with practices and so on. So you can see that this sort, again, of flexibility and dynamics seem to be an aspect of many practices, even of the most simple practices. Even a simple guru yoga will have these aspects. Yeah, maybe not as complex and detailed as in other practices, but nevertheless, this basic procedure seems to be there. And the interesting thing now is, of course, that you can adapt that and change that and shift that around according to whatever is your need. Yeah? So you see that there is also a relatively high degree of personal individual reflection that seems to be required. That goes also along with the, I suppose, relatively high degree of individual responsibility. And I think this is also another markers that seem to go along with a certain, let's say, with a somewhat more progressive tradition in total. Yeah, and it's always easier, of course, as you say, to follow a linear path, but to understand like how to adopt the different possibilities, of which there are plenty, in which given phase of your life, in order to, as you described it, to follow a general trajectory. Yeah, that seems to be in itself a relative complex issue. So in some sense, you can see that however we try to tackle it, we see that it is very difficult to define a working mechanism that seems to be able to apply to most of these traditions. And this in itself seems to speak to the nature of the tradition to some degree. It sounds paradoxical and somewhat apophatic, but what can you do? The question is then again, like, how can you apply such a general understanding to be faithful to details that you look at? And this seems to be one major challenge, where I frankly would not want to be a scientist so much in such a regard. Yeah.
Well, I think you really point out one of the critical challenges of studying it, right? Is that in a sadhana practice, unless those who are observing and taking data really know that practice and really know that practitioner, right? They're not going to be able to see where they are when certain phenomena are being expressed or measured. And so I think this is part of the issue that we've seen across many different studies, is that a sadhana has a certain structure or framework, but the practitioner themselves reporting on their experience could completely intervene into the experience, right? And so it's not like, for example, in the Tukdom, we don't say, hold on, we'd like to get a little experience sampling there. Just put a little pause on that, right? Or in the lucid dreaming experience, right? Like, let's just wake you up for a second and let's get a full detailed report, right? So how do we elicit data in these really remarkable transformations of consciousness? And that, as Michael had said, that they might be applying many of these techniques simultaneously within a given experience, practice, whatsoever, even though their primary practice might be categorized in a different way.
Yeah, that's why the neurophenomenology approach is so important. This is a combination of two long words: neuroscience and phenomenology. Neurophenomenology, it's called. It's a methodological approach. There's a lot to be said about it, but the idea in particular that you can look at neurophysiological data, what happens in the body, including the brain, and correlate it with experiential data of the phenomena that is experienced, the study of phenomenology. And in particular, I think, when we're talking about studying contemplative practices, we're talking about studying human experience. And that we're also talking about studying the human organism. But we're talking about the human organism undergoing a certain experience. And that phenomenology as a methodology for the study of contemplative practices is critical. It's something that the field is just learning how to do. It's in its infant stages. However, over the last 20 years, there's been significant progress. I think that the pathway forward for phenomenology is very promising. I see it being refined, and I see different iterations of phenomenology becoming more and more rigorous as a method. And it allows us, as was just said, if you're just looking at EEG, you can't really stop someone experience and ask them, etc. But actually, for phenomenology, you can, right? At least under controlled setting of a study, you can at any moment interrupt them and undergo a phenomenological interview with the experience that they had. Now, as soon as you interrupt it, it's not the exact experience. I recognize that. However, it's very, very close, right? And sometimes people continue to have experience, they're sort of in it, if you will, while they begin to describe it, and to have a framework and a protocol that has some kind of rigor and really can help navigate and steer and elicit contemplative experience is very important, I would argue, as if not more important than understanding what kind of correlates are happening in the brain. And ideally, the neurophenomenology phenomenological approach will look at both and try to correlate them. And again, there's a lot to be said about that. But I just want to say that as far as meditation research is concerned, this is an area that the field more broadly is increasingly invested in. The lab that I run here at Contemplative Sciences Center, we're building a whole research hub, a phenomenology research hub to study meditative experiences and work with, Anyways, we have an interdisciplinary lab, so we also do the neuroscience part and the philosophy part and phenomenological part, etc. But just how important understanding the dynamics of lived experience is if we want to understand contemplative experience.
You know, you used that word there, Michael, emic. And of course, the categories that you're listing here, the styles, if you want, attentional, imaginal, somatic, etc. We could say they're sort of an etic characterization or categorization. And presumably, the reason to come up with such a etic, that is to say, from outside of the tradition, characterization, is for two purposes, really. On the one hand, of dividing the subject of study in some way for study, and maybe also the beginnings of proposing some kind of explanatory framework. Perhaps in these categories or categories like them, we might find some unique mechanisms or unique combination of mechanisms that have explanatory value, not only value in cutting up or dividing up the subject of study, but also perhaps in explaining it. And that makes me think of sort of two extremes. On the one hand, we could say, and I think these extremes, I'm going to characterize them in a bit of an exaggerated fashion, although I don't think they're too far away from what one can hear. On one hand, you might say, well, we ought to study the tradition on its own terms, using its own taxonomies. And we've already been discussing some of that here, actually. Its own way of dividing its and explaining its subject of study. After all, there we're going to find the answers. And really it's a case of finding some way, perhaps even of working through that taxonomy, that emic taxonomy, validating or discovering or catching up, really, neuroscientifically catching up with what's already been discovered in another epistemological mode. Or the other extreme, we could say, we should throw out all of these emic categorizations and taxonomies. We should assume that there is something happening there. Let's assume that, let's hypothesize that. We'll start with that idea, but it's certainly not what's understood currently in the tradition to be happening. And so we need to throw out all presuppositions and really come in with a totally fresh approach. I actually think both of these are reasonable modes of inquiry. On the one hand, let's assume it is how it's described, and on the other hand, let's assume it's nothing like it's described. These are actually can be quite two creative positions. So I'm curious about this. When does the etic categorizations, when is there dissonance with the emic ones, the traditional ones? Why do we depart from the traditional characterizations when we do? What's the reason for that? In other words, explaining the dissonances. Is there anything from the traditional frameworks we can carry with us? Or must we have them both, a sort of parallel taxonomies on the table to work effectively? So this tension, I suppose, between the emic and the etic, when we depart from it, why do we? And what can we keep, if anything?
Don't you think that's the tension between the relative and the absolute by any means and stretch of the imagination in some way? Okay, I mean, let's say it like this, yeah. The Tibetans, when they thought about what the Indians did, could not actually verify if their understanding was always correct or not. They were relatively close to the tradition, much closer than we are. So what we're doing is we are looking at their understanding, and bring this into our equation. And within that tradition, there is people that are here and now living, with whom we can, discuss, and with whom we can inquire and who we can interview. And we use this in order to refine what we think of our attempt of making sense of what we have in front of us. And I do not believe that there is a way of having a pure way of one of either of the two approaches. I suppose that is not possible. Frankly speaking, I think it's not even meaningful to attempt that, because I think that will be too limited. But personally, I do think this, and I can just see it even when I want to translate a single sentence, you know, like just plain philological things. Already there, I can see it. Yeah, I mean, what do I do? Do I try to stay faithful and literal? And is that actually, if it doesn't quite get the meaning, actually faithful and literal? Perhaps it is not. But as soon as I depart, there is no chance that anybody will, or that there will be nobody who will criticize me for not being faithful and literal. Yeah, because I have to interpret things then at one point, right? If there is not a one-to-one correlation in an ideal world, you know, like there is no point how we can achieve this. But I think it is interesting, nevertheless, to think about it, because it should help us, you know, like to get not to get rid of biases, because we are living in a world where science is an important means of inquiry, and in the past it has been different means, you know, by which somebody would verify their tradition. Yeah, other forms of rhetorics and sciences that they had in the ancient times, but they were doing the very same thing that we are trying to do now, just different means. It's at least how I look at it.
Yeah, I'd like to offer just a little bit something from the Tibetan medical side before turning it over to Michael. I think thinking about these traditions as transmitted with certain kinds of realization and certain kinds of blessings is also really important. So, for example, in the Gyushi, in the four medical tantras, the text is written poetically and metaphorically. And despite my interest in describing a lung pulse and all the different ways I want to describe it because of the things that I think it feels like, it literally must feel like lungi tseni zubjin yangwatang tangxing talasashin yoyen. It's rough and coarse, it's light and hard, it's mobile, right? And so these are the things that my teachers again and again and again, whenever I would try and describe it, would come right back to the same exact phrase and say, no, this is what you're feeling. And then you bring your somatic experience to that metaphor, and it builds this incredibly complex web of data, right? Of experience, of layers and layers of what does that lung pulse look like in all of its different modes and all of its different expressions, so that when I read it again, when I recite it again, it has a whole other phenomenology, if you will, because of that built experience over time. And I think when we think about a lot of practice words like salewa, shigewa, jenewa, right? This like the clarity, right? The vividness, the rawness, right? The nakedness. It's like it's an experience that is ineffable in some ways, but these at least give you something to start working with, that language to express what you're experiencing. So I don't know if it's necessarily pure or non-pure, but I think there is a blessing in the realization that we receive from these traditions.
That's beautiful, Tawni. Thank you. I totally agree. I think, you know, for me at least, the departure point is trust in these traditions. I mean, when you have a kind of immersion in the tradition, when you have a kind of, you know, practice life, a contemplative life, when you have immersion in this, in the text and with the culture, then over time there comes a point for me where I just I trust. I just have total trust that because I've seen over and over and over so many times in so many different ways that these techniques work, right? That as Tawni's saying, with her medical example, there's certain structures that we can argue against, and we can think we can do better, and we can think no, that isn't it, and we're certainly welcome to do that. There's nothing preventing us. However, if we trust that they've discovered that these traditions, whether they be medical or contemplative, have a certain, way of doing things that will restructure the human being, whether it be for health, whether it be for spiritual transformation, psychological well-being, whatever it may be that they're designed to do, then that in itself is the process. That's what they're intended to do. That's their purpose. And that's the emic approach, right? That's the total emic approach. And I think that's very, very important. I also recognize that we live in a world that has operative paradigms that are very different. We have encounter epistemologies that are totally foreign to the tradition up until very recently. I recognize that we have a whole ontology that we operate in as modern English-speaking people, and that in order to have a kind of shared lexicon and shared models to do research, which is what we do, what I do, then it requires a kind of translation process, because two things. One, you can't convert all the researchers in the world to Tibetan Buddhism, and why should you? But two, it's not just about, any one tradition. It's about, the human contemplative heritage. And that has taken many manifestations across the history of our species and our planet. And that if we're interested in a kind of more generalized understanding of the operative and underlying mechanisms and dynamics and processes and complexities of that humans undergo under contemplative practice technique, then that requires not just translating Tibetan texts into English, but it actually requires a next level, a second order translation, a cultural translation, a kind of a translation into a different episteme. And that's at the level of the etic. And not all etic projects, I would argue, and I'm not saying that this is valuable, but I would say not all etic projects are valuable. I think there's certainly, a lot of wheel spinning. However, I also think that, there are different orders or registers of translation involved in this project, and first level translation can be very literal, and that in itself has multiple layers, right? As Julian referenced, whether you want to go literal or poetic, as Tawni referenced, or vibrational, etc. There's many different registers even at that level, or sort of ways of doing it at that register. But then second order register, I would call, if you want to call it etic, I think that's fair, outside the tradition, is really, also trying to consider knowledge that isn't just from a single tradition, but incorporates and includes other bodies of knowledge, in this case, contemplative human knowledge, and that is translatable and generalizable to humans that more broadly. And then, of course, the scientific enterprise can then operate at that level. The scientific project, the scientific enterprise is a second order operation, right? And we have to recognize that. It's never going to, it's not intended to, it can't access first order cultural phenomenological knowledge. It's not what it's meant to do. So that's okay. It's okay to have, not only okay, I would argue it's just the paradox of, it's the paradoxical paradigm. We live in the paradoxical paradigm, and as researchers trying to understand contemplative practices, then so the project is then how do we bring those different levels of, or orders, if you will, of knowledge into conversation, and now it's welcome to the field of the contemplative sciences. It's an epistemological project, and I wouldn't say that one is more valid than the other, one is more important than the other, one should be valorized and the other not. I think all of those things are frankly based on just biases, whatever they may be. They can be cultural biases, they can be disciplinary biases, they can just be personal, predilections, etc. However, if we're sincere, I would adamantly push, I do adamantly push, if we're sincere about understanding human contemplative experience, then we need multiple orders of knowledge in conversation.
I will also say that this is something that plagues anthropology. Etic
Yeah.
versus emic perspectives, right? And do we throw out all the theorists that were maybe, white settler colonists that can explain it in their terms, right? Or are they emic perspectives that we bring from the cultures and languages that they arose from? And I think we realize that we live in an English vernacular in this academic world, and then how to represent that knowledge in specific ways with specific intellectual traditions, science being one specific cultural tradition, intellectual tradition, then we have to think about what ways that we translate that knowledge. I think one example is a co-authored monograph that I'm doing with three of my Tibetan medical colleagues, Tibetan medical scholars colleagues. And so we were talking a lot about, why do you need to translate the 5 elements into other things? And my colleague Barbara was talking about how Tim Ingold, who is in many ways a phenomenological anthropologist, brings the element of it's the stoniness of the substance. And I'm like, well, why don't you just say the earth element, right? But in that sense, it offers some conceptual bridge for those who are more familiar with that kind of approach to knowledge, right? That maybe the earth element doesn't represent that for them. So how we translate these concepts and create those bridges, and that's the massive project of great translators, right? Throughout history, throughout time, and the projects of creating those proper terms that really represent or culturally represent that knowledge in specific ways, in specific contexts.
And why it's an interdisciplinary project, why humanists and scientists, why social scientists, are included in imperative in order to undergo this kind of research. And if we limit it to disciplines or silo expertise, we will only get one set of knowledge about being human. And we know very well that we are not, or I am not, I'll speak for myself, I am not a single set of data. So it's also just, I think intuitively, however hard, however challenging, it's just, if we're interested in complex human experience and its transformations, consciousness and its transformations, And consciousness studies riddle with the same issues as contemplative sciences. I would say that these are have a lot of parallels. It's just, we've come to the conclusion, I think, as a field that it's imperative to have multiple ways of knowing in conversation.
I mean, in some way, you could even argue and say that that this distinction, let's say, of the insider versus the outsider perspective is inevitable for everybody who wants to do serious sciences in order to, let's say, in order to give yourself a means to investigate your own shortcomings in trying to approach something. And I think this is, in some sense, is a fundamental academic principle. Yeah. So you cannot only do, let's say, one thing that's on the other side, like the pendulum has also to swing to the other side to give you room and perspective, even if it's something that you usually wouldn't engage in, because otherwise you're contributing to your own scholastic narcissism in some way, in one way or the other. Yeah. And what I've only, the only point that I find really challenging in this approach to be open is, of course, that it requires you to constantly go out of your comfort zone and to try to deal with things that you probably will not properly understand, where you're actually required that colleagues who are well meant and have a little bit of patience will try to help you in that process. And this is actually why it, as Michael said, it must be an interdisciplinary project. And at the same time, of course, it also requires everybody to be, let's say, courageous enough to be able to forget about the mechanics of your discipline, the toolbox of your discipline that you have used to learn. That you have got used to apply. Yeah. And in some sense, that is reflecting on your own emic perspective, which brings you back actually to what the tradition ultimately wants from you. Interestingly enough, there is a very deep similarity between the two. It's just not so easy to see it, I believe, if you know what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
That's very fascinating indeed. I love this comparison of translation from one language to another as a sort of translation from one episteme, as you said, Michael and Julian, Tawni, to another. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it. As interesting as it is to discuss this sort of a thing, I do think it has practical application on carrying out research. For example, if one is too wedded to this etic approach, to this approach of saying, well, let's just come from the outside and come up with our own categories and not listen to them. And of course, you might miss something that's right there in the description. But on the other hand, if you're too wedded to the emic and can't see outside of it, then you might be misled by perhaps a representation within the tradition that just takes you down a different path, and one can't think outside of it. And this idea of translation. So I think, therefore, combining these approaches or using them both in some sort of a way, as you've all been describing, this creative paradoxal tension, perhaps it corrects for both of those things. And there's also this thing of translation. When I think of translation, I think of understanding, and sometimes even in conversation, when to be understood and to be reflected back sometimes gives tremendous insight somehow to oneself. So I wonder, is there a sense in which progress in the scientific study of Tantra, as we've been discussing here, might teach something to the tradition about the mechanisms of its operation? Is that too grand, arrogant, maybe a claim, an idea? Might there be some lessons on the operational level, some refining perhaps, of the technical procedures of these techniques that could come from a never more precise scientific, neuroscientific, whatever the case is, neuroscience understanding that might be taken up by the tradition and have a dialogue going in both ways. I mean, I'm being provocative here, and that's sort of my job, so please forgive me for that. But what do you think of that idea? Is that something that we have in the back of our, or is it merely a means to translate these techniques, which work so well in their own contexts, to people who are not coming from that context? Is it merely a one-way process, or might there be a return message?
I will say that one thing that's kind of come up for me just being in these consciousness and often with psychedelics as part of the conversation, it's made me reflect on how in the Tibetan world, psychedelics are not used in the way that they are in many different cultures, almost, completely absent in some ways because the techniques are so psychedelic. But that from what at least I've learned in these exchanges, and we were just before coming on here talking about Gudullin's work at Berkeley and her work with cephalopods and neuroplasticity and critical periods and using psychedelics to create those neuroplastic changes, and that so much of what seems to be coming out is that as we age, these interventions are really helpful and help shake up those patterns in ways that allow us for new insights. And psychedelics can be one of those ways that new pathways are forged. But I often think about how in the Tibetan tradition, we often have pretty strong perspective that, that you should memorize all the things before you're 20 or else your brain solidifies or your mind solidifies and you're done, and how it's really hard to take on practices over one's lifetime. And it's really unique for those who are long-term practitioners to access those critical periods of change, and that it gets harder as you move on. And I often wonder how that could be a nice paradigm to think about ways of framing practices and ways of framing aging and the need for different kinds of practices as we age over time because of different kind of fossilization of our habits and obscurations.
I think I've made this argument several times in different contexts. So if we observe Buddhism, how it developed, let's say since its very conception, we see that wherever it went, it changed according to, let's say, the different circumstances of the culture and their people, and I also could refer to many cases in which some of the things that have been then preserved elsewhere went back to the place where they originated, where such things might have been lost or changed or corrupted or stagnated or whatever might have happened, So I do think that in a complex world of interaction, to be now a little bit provocative, that cultural appropriation is not necessarily a negative thing. It can also be a form of showing your respect and interest, but that you then change and shape something in as appropriate to your, let's say, to your needs or the circumstances of your society, I do believe is natural, and in some sense it is even imperative to do so. And therefore, I do think that through exchange, we will certainly see that what we now call traditional forms of practice, will it change? And will it take different forms? And then, of course, the question is like, do we think and do we agree that they, in their essence, still work towards a shared common goal, that it is itself not, let's say, subject to change by, let's say, by shape-shifting slightly its appearance within a different cultural setting. So this is how I look at it, like historically speaking, and I think it would actually be, in some sense, a sign of our inability to to probably engage with the riches of the practice should there not be any form of such exchange and interchange and change that you described, Steve. That would be my reply to this. I would find it unnatural.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a looping effect with an encounter of Buddhism with a culture, and as Julian points out, we can see that historically. We can point to instances, and certainly in the case of Tibetan Buddhism over the last 1,000 years, 1,300 years, as historians, it's very evident that what was happening in India and what happened in Tibet were very different cultural experiences of Buddhism. And we're kind of in the 11th century. I hate to break it to you folks, but this is, this moment of historical encounter with a radically different kind of tradition of human transformation, and we're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to translate it, and we're trying to integrate it into our working mindsets, into our working ontologies and episteme, cultural episteme. And as we do that, I have firm conviction that new practices will emerge, and that those practices will be resonant with the understandings of the tradition if they're done with care by communities of practitioners under the affordances of the tradition as a whole. I personally am, as a researcher, quite interested and invested in finding some of these expedient means, techniques that we referenced earlier in the conversation, a kind of upaya. And I think that we have ability to do that. We have in our lab a whole wing of research in the Circle lab that I run here at the University of Virginia that's dedicated to understand the interface of immersive technologies with contemplative technique and how they open and transform human experience, particularly the senses, human sense-making processes. And I think that, we're at a moment here where we have technologies of immersive and transformative technologies in particular that, if harnessed with the right intentionality and the right intelligence, and by that I mean an understanding of the traditions, their philosophical principles, their contemplative principles, their ethical principles, and their contextual principles, that if those principles, which we've been working to identify and curate and then translate in a systematic way into a design process with immersive and transformative technologies, that's one way. Certainly there will be others, but it's one way that we can devise new platforms of contemplative technology that are quite expedient, I would argue, for human transformation. Let me give you one concrete example, because I've been working on it all summer and deeply into it. Is we have a project here in our lab taking one of the things that I referenced in one of the earlier episodes, these practices of dream yoga from the Tibetan tradition, and we are purposing them through an intentional, systematic design process that we've been undergoing since the late spring through the summer in an intensive manner. We now have a prototype of a virtual reality meditation that simulates dream experiences and illusory body experiences based on an alternative aesthetic that does not replicate or mimic your ordinary waking consciousness, and instead is designed to induce a dreamlike experience in a dreamlike world as a dreamlike body and undergo the tasks prescribed in historical dream yoga literature, but all, again, completely conformed to virtuality. So you are awake with a headset on and you enter another alternative space, the dream world, and you appear as a completely different identity, the dream body, and you undergo these, again, discrete tasks that, again, we're taking and translating from historical dream yoga manuals, meditation manuals, from the Tibetan tradition that I've translated, and then you perform them, and you can perform in a waking virtuality, dreamlike experiences in ways that are very powerful because, one, you're awake, and lucidity is already there, so you can cultivate it with technique, and then to be able to induce a heightened level of illusion and dreamlike reality with a heightened lucidity, is very powerful. And that's the kind of practice we're going to undergo a pilot and then a full study over the next, year and a half of the effects, physiological, phenomenological effects of this kind of virtual reality meditation. And it's one example, I would say, of some of the things, we've been talking about in this conversation about expediency, about translation, etic, but then also in response to your question, Steve, of going back to the tradition, right? So there's a full loop here. We're then taking, these practices from the historical tradition, and we are purposing them in a contemporary modality, this virtual reality meditation. And, we're already in conversation with lamas about doing this, and we're working with practitioners of the tradition. We have a whole team of practitioner consultants, as well as myself and a design team and people who are very familiar with the different facets of this project. It's an incredible team, frankly. And all of that is working in ways to sort of, it's one approach. It's not the only approach. There's different approaches to what I would say devising new contemplative practices. And that's one. There are others, but fundamentally here, and then I'll open it up here, but fundamentally, we think about this process that you're talking about as manifold. One is what I'll call the native approach, which is, just sort of go native, right? Just go into the tradition and pretend you're Tibetan, or pretend you're Islamic, or pretend you're whatever, and it's sort of the outsider going in and just adapting it, and that's one entirely valid approach. And I've done that, Tawni's done that, if I can call you out. Like, that's one whole approach. Another approach is to what the mindfulness movement did, which is take a portion of the tradition and segment it and try to extract very particular factors and operationalize those factors, and then try to understand them out of context, out of any kind of cultural embeddedness, with no framework for, philosophical worldview or of the human being, or anything that the tradition would typically consider critical and contextual for those processes of human transformation. That's another whole paradigm, and that's kind of a secular approach of what I call the extraction approach. And then what we're looking at, our approach here has been, well, okay, let's look at the traditions, let's look at the context, let's try to understand the underlying dynamics, but then let's find new ways to purpose them. And, again, the example I used with the dream yoga virtual reality meditation we're designing is one effort in that direction. But I would just say, more broadly, I think that the full loop, and it may it be an infinite loop, between the contemporary world that we live in and the paradigms that we operate in, and the worlds of Tibetan Buddhism and the paradigms of human transformation that they offer, for them to loop into each other, that there be a deep and intentional and purposeful practice and knowledge exchange between the two. So I think it's wholly possible. I think it's happening. And I think that, there's new frontiers here as neuroscience opens up new visions, frankly, of the human brain, where, what we've come to understand in the last 20 years is exceptional just about the brain itself, and the rest of the human organism. Again, we've made, leaps and bounds around things like genetics and the human heart, etc. And then, you couple that with deep understanding, which again, I think we are just at the precipice of understanding human experience and phenomenology, lived experience. I think we're just making headway in a systematic way. And you couple that with these deep, rich traditions that are, have, vast and deep resources to contribute to our understanding of being human and transforming ourselves, then I think that the equation, it will and is inevitably new practices and technologies of human transformation. Absolutely.
I will also say it's been super fascinating for me to watch at Center for Healthy Minds here in Madison, where we primarily do these extractive versions, right? Where whether it's MBSR or our Healthy Minds program, that was very much inspired by the preliminaries. Mingyur Rinpoche and His Holiness really guided the development of that, but was really looking at these skills within practices. So looking at awareness, social connectivity, insight, purpose, right? But doing it in a secular way that can translate across different traditions, purpose being framed within one's, spiritual belief practices and so forth, or non-spiritual. And that those practices, actually, we were even thinking that, wow, we have a lot of interest from the Tibetan youth about wanting to try these practices because they're validated, quote, by science. And we're like, but they came from the Tibetan Buddhist world. And it's just been interesting to watch that process. Or so many of our Tibetan community here in North America work in the health field, right? Our nurses and doctors and social workers. And so they want to use things like MBSR for their patients, right, to help support their healing processes or support, aspects of resilience and mental health. And so to see that translation happening even within these different cultural worlds has been just really fascinating. So I think we're in a very interesting time.
What I find interesting to observe is that I think within academia and scholastic approaches, there seems to be a slow yet gradual acknowledgement of the fact that there is an individual experience that is valid. And I do think that is something very healthy, and probably it brings us back to something that actually always was part, of, if you will, philosophy, religion, psychology, which not always have been, traditionally speaking, distinct fields of inquiry. Thinking about the Buddhist project, for instance, I do not think that they viewed themselves in these categories, and particularly not as those categories being distinct from each other. and it was an academic project, to turn it into these. And now we have to acknowledge that this project has huge limitations. And I do think that is something very healthy, actually, to really stop pretending that we have nothing to do with what we look for and inquire and are interested in. And I do think actually that this is something that can give us a little bit of hope, like in sometimes very corrupted academic institutions. Just as a personal anecdote. And interestingly enough, it also has a lot to do with Tantra. Thinking about the fact, for instance, that ultimate realization will give you the means to verify that your relative means and the postulates that you made, that they are verified. And this is a completely different paradigm than what is proposed by the scientific paradigm. And to be able to adopt this and to acknowledge that this is a valid approach seems to me to contribute to the processes that you, Tawni, and Michael were describing in terms of, like making progress of understanding something about the human nature.
Yeah, may I just comment? I think, your comments here, Julian, really strike a nerve for me that I just want to articulate for a moment, in that the idea of human freedom as something that isn't social or political merely, certainly bound within social political context, cultural context, but freedom, meaning here kind of a spiritual freedom, is so foreign to so many people right now that the idea that you would study techniques of human transformation that are liberative or designed to be liberative, intended to be liberative, that is to say, to free the human beings of the constraints of their ordinary consciousness and all of the kind of constrictedness of cognitive, perceptual, emotional, physical, somatic, physiosomatic, constraint that cause pain in the world, is so radically foreign that it's unrecognizable. And instead, the understanding of these, or at least the study of these practices and their traditions that they come from, has really just veered off in two directions. One, and these are great ways for it to go, and my work is very much centered around these, but I do want to make the observation here that one, which has been an undercurrent in the conversation that's bubbled up a few times, is that you look at these techniques in order to understand the benefits of health. And it's primarily mental health. And that there are well-being equivalents that can be derived from understanding the mechanisms and the processes of contemplative practices, and that they are for human well-being because it makes people feel better, and there's long-term, maybe there's longitudinal effects, but most of it is sort of short-term, and relaxation for anxiety, and again, it's this antidotal approach that I was talking about earlier, right? It's thinking about what are contemplative technique or meditation as medicine, right? How can you apply it for largely mental health, but let's just call it well-being. The other trajectory that's predominant, again, has bubbled up in this conversation, and it runs parallel to the discourse on psychedelics research, is, okay, what are meditative and contemplative techniques going to tell us about human consciousness, and how can we solve the hard problem, and what is it to unriddle ourselves of materialism and reductionism because we're so deeply entangled as a Cartesian entity, we know the whole discourse, right? So very well, and that in many ways is a self-made problem, and yet that is also a problem that scientific materialism faces head on, and in real ways that have real world consequences. And yet, even if we were to untangle that through understanding contemplative practices as a gateway to human consciousness, again, a line of research I'm deeply involved in, oftentimes the end game is building better AI or trying to make sense of consciousness for some other end other than freeing the human being. So you have these two trajectories, the kind of mental health well-being trajectory and all kinds of clinical applications, which again, it's one of the trajectories of the field. The other trajectory, consciousness, and much of that now is deeply entangled with the artificial intelligence conversation. If we're going to understand consciousness, it's really to build better AI so we can have AI robots and so on and so forth. And we know that whole discourse. But where it's not even almost acknowledged that there's an embarkation point that's soteriological. That is to say, that even suggests that you would undergo human transformation in radical, intentional ways for something other than just feeling better or contributing to a broader reductionistic project. And instead, that there's a possibility of being different in the world that is almost entirely alien to most humans, and yet paradoxically is descriptive of the human state. It is described as the nature of the mind. So here we are trying to understand in ways that kind of missed the point entirely. And again, not that this way or that way aren't worthwhile research projects. I'm involved and deeply interested in both. And yet I do want to point out that there is a blind spot here, which is our own lived potentiality, and that we need to, as a field, as a scientific project, talk about that more.
But Michael, we're not allowed to talk about that one.
Oh, see, nobody told me that.
No, we are also, it's not even allowed. It's like that we are not even allowing it ourselves, even though people even would appreciate it, I think that is like really a self-made prison. I mean, like, look at study of Buddhism, philology. We had to pretend it's philosophy, so that we can study it, because if it is religious studies, then we're doing, I don't know, like boo-hoo-hoo, esoteric nonsense, is not allowed. And so we frame something as something that it was not, just for the sake of being allowed to study it without hearing or the need to address other people's biases that, by the way, are completely irrational, actually, No, but what you paraphrased it very well. This is what I try to say in my clumsy way, that we can allow ourselves, to be invested in what we study without that we need to pretend it has nothing to do with ourselves, because in fact it has first and foremost most to do with ourselves, and then comes all the rest in some way. If we are honest about it, I think it's true. Like a form of positive egoism, if you want to say it like this, Not sure, but well, But it's nice, like young generations now, they're okay with being religious. I mean, there you have to watch out that it's not going into the other extreme, right? That there is something wrong with you if you do not claim that you're religious or particularly invested in a certain way or not, huh?
Yeah, I'm not saying we need to be religious, but I am saying that, to take the possibility and potentiality of human freedom as a basis for inquiry is so often overlooked. And if we were to do that, what kind of findings would that open up as researchers and just as human beings?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Michael? I mean, it's highly paradoxical if you think about that. Most of the most valued thinkers, philosophers, religious person, whoever it might be, that they were never thinking of, let's say, theoretical knowledge and relative application of certain mechanics or outcomes of a certain understanding of whatever sort as opposed things, such as you paraphrase them. There is a theoretical application, towards abstract ideas, and there is a practical means towards, like contributing to the wellness project, let's say, yeah, as if those things would be different things. Ultimately, of course, they shouldn't be. And traditions, for sure, didn't view it as opposed things. Yeah? They would always think, if I understand human consciousness, I'm going to be a happier person, and I can help others achieving that. Huh? And ultimately, it is interesting to think about it in that terms, perhaps. Huh?
I will say, I think this is the critical importance of really interdisciplinary and community partnered work, is that even the basic assumptions of what you're looking at and why and what the outcomes are going to offer to different communities and benefits is a reflexive process. So I think in the Tuktum research, often we've contemplated, like, why are we doing this? And are we actually inhibiting or possibly creating conditions of harm that could inhibit the achievement of this remarkable state, right? And I think that's a very conscious, reflexive process that's always still in process as we continue to do the work and continue to reflect with His Holiness and other teachers who are guiding us, lamas and rinpoches as well, as senior practitioners. So I think we are coming from different traditions of what knowledge produces and why, right? And so how we can also be reflexive in that as a team, as a shared community of practice in the exploration of that knowledge.
Paradoxical a bit, nevertheless, if you think, I mean, it's, like, think about all the programmers who came up with the AI stuff, and give or take, and give it 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and all of these guys, nobody will need the programmer anymore because this AI completely took off. So they shoveled their own graves, actually, in some way, paradoxically enough. And not so sure, but I mean, like the beginning of the conversation, there was the question, like, okay, like, why study these things scientifically? Like, if the end of the day there comes something out, is like we have to think about if our way of studying scientifically is actually, is actually conducive towards what we wanted. It's also has a certain paradoxical twist to it. If the outcome actually is that the means and ways of doing it is actually not appropriate towards the end of which we were upholding, towards the outcomes. Not sure. It has also apophatic in some way, also a little bit tantric in some way, Yeah. Anyway.
Well, goodness me. Fascinating. Thank you, all of you. What an interesting exploration this has been. I might have to propose a fourth Fourth not a fourth turning, maybe exactly, but we've done 3 now. We may as well do the 4th. It's in our sort of pre-meeting chat, one of the subjects that came up from more than one of you was this idea of practices for our times, or practices designated as suitable for our times, which are characterized sometimes, aren't they, as a sort of degenerate age or dark times. And that's a fascinating jumping off point. And not to mention other ethical and theoretical and practical questions. We have so much more we could discuss. So I might have to at least seed the idea of a fourth meeting. But in any case, this has been so fascinating. Thank you, all 3 of you, for your contributions. Tawni, Michael, and Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.